Do you have any advice for international colleagues whose English is their second language, and they may not be as comfortable with all of the usages in English?
I would say that the number one thing is speak confidently. You're going to make mistakes. You have to assume that. However, how you deal with the mistakes and how you deal with the person responding to you after a mistake is what's most important. You still want to stay confident. You don't want to act like the world is falling apart. The chance is very high that when you speak English, your English is going to be more proper and better than the person you're talking to, because you will use fewer slang words, and you might even use words and words in context that help the person you're talking to, because you're reminding them the way English should be spoken.
Yep, I think that's great. And I have found too, even English is my first language. When I'm talking to people, I will often I'll say something, I'll say, does that make sense? Or do you understand? To get their agreement that we're on the same page, they know what we're talking about before we move on to the next thing. So I think, simply pausing and, saying, does that make sense? And, if they need you to clarify or re-communicate anything, it gives you an opportunity to do that before moving forward.
Yeah, I would like to highlight one other thing about languages. Americans are very poor in learning and speaking other languages. That is true across the board for most Americans. For example, many Europeans can speak 5, 6, 7 languages almost fluently and bounce between the languages. Americans are lucky if they could speak 2.
Yeah.
So as somebody who's been around, come from other countries, who could speak multiple other languages, that's something you could add to the people you're working with and for, because as the world has become more global, the people you're working with and for want to learn more about the rest of the world. As somebody from outside the US, you know more about that than the people you're working with. Share that with them. Show that you're valuable to them, and maybe even start to teach them another language.
I think that's a great advice, Paul. Would you agree that most Americans are very US centric? Like, we know what's going on in the US, but are naive about world events?
Yes, most Americans are very poor at world geography. Most American adults do not have an active passport. That stuns people from outside the US when I tell them that. For example, I remember working with I learned that over 85% of Australian adults have active passports, which means they're current, they're valid, and they've traveled outside of that part of the Pacific Rim.
Yeah.
Contrast that with Americans, where you have many Americans who rarely leave their own state.
Yeah, I was going to say, not even going internationally. They're not even crossing a state border. They kind of stay in their hometown, and that's it.
So as an intern, you may have the label intern, but there's a topic that you know much better than most Americans, which is world affairs, world geography, other languages, sensing other cultures. Use that to your advantage, because if you're in a business that's doing business around the world, you could make yourself invaluable to that company.